The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over Marcus Holloway's backyard. The faint sound of cicadas hummed in the distance, blending with the soft rippling of water as he floated in his pool. This was his sanctuary, the one place where he could relax after a grueling week of work. His job as an architect demanded precision, long hours, and relentless deadlines. But here, in the cool embrace of his own pool, in the home he had worked so hard to afford, he could finally breathe. The neighborhood of Maplewood Heights was a picturesque suburb, known for its immaculate lawns, quiet streets, and a homeowners association that prided itself on keeping things a certain way. Marcus had moved in 2 years ago, one of the few black homeowners in a predominantly white neighborhood. It wasn't hostility that greeted him when he arrived, at least not outright. It was the stares, the whispered conversations that hushed whenever he walked past, the way his neighbors seemed to monitor his activities more than others. But Marcus was used to it. He had spent his entire life proving that he belonged in spaces others thought he didn't. Taking a deep breath, he pushed off the pool's edge, allowing himself to float, staring up at the sky. Peace. That's all he wanted. But lately something had felt off. It started with small, almost unnoticeable things. A patio chair slightly out of place, wet footprints near the gate when he hadn't been outside that day, and once his towel, the one he always left draped over the poolside chair, missing entirely. He had brushed it off, thinking maybe he had misplaced it or forgotten to put it back. But then yesterday he noticed something undeniable. As he walked out onto his patio with his morning coffee, his pool water rippled, as if someone had just gotten out. He checked his security cameras, but for some reason, the footage from the past 2 nights was corrupted. That's when the unease truly settled in. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Just as he was about to relax again, a sharp voice pierced the tranquility of his evening. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." Marcus' head snapped toward the fence that separated his property from his next-door neighbor. Karen Monroe. She stood with her arms crossed, her face twisted in irritation. A woman in her late 40s, draped in an overpriced designer sundress that looked out of place on her. Karen was known for 2 things: complaints and entitlement. Marcus sighed. So much for peace. He pulled himself out of the water, grabbing a towel and draping it over his shoulders. He had dealt with Karen before, her glares, her passive-aggressive comments, her thinly veiled microaggressions. But something about the way she was looking at him now, this wasn't just another one of her usual complaints. This was something else, something more. Marcus tightened the towel around his shoulders, his muscles tensing as Karen's sharp glare cut through the humid evening air. She stood at the edge of her yard, fingers gripping the wooden fence that separated their properties as if she were holding herself back from storming onto his lawn. "I didn't realize this was a public pool," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Karen scoffed, shaking her head in exaggerated frustration. "You've been in there for hours, and quite frankly, it's disruptive. People around here enjoy a peaceful neighborhood, you know?" Marcus suppressed an irritated sigh. Peaceful neighborhood? He had lived here for 2 years without throwing a single party, blasting loud music, or causing any kind of commotion. Meanwhile, Karen had hosted at least 3 rowdy wine nights with her group of gossipy friends, their laughter carrying through the night well past acceptable hours. "I'm just swimming, Karen," Marcus said, keeping his tone even. "In my pool. On my property." Karen narrowed her eyes. "It's not just that. There have been disturbances lately. Suspicious activity. I don't know if you've noticed, but people have been on edge." Marcus' jaw tightened. There was the coded language. Suspicious. People on edge. She wasn't talking about disturbances. She was talking about him. "I haven't noticed anything unusual," Marcus said, though that wasn't entirely true. He had noticed the strange occurrences, the missing towel, the moved furniture, the distorted security footage. But none of that had anything to do with Karen's sudden concern. She tilted her head, eyes scanning him like he was a problem she was trying to solve. "Well, I just think you should be more considerate. You know, given everything going on in the world these days." Marcus' stomach turned. Everything going on in the world? He knew exactly what she meant. Another subtle reminder that in her eyes, he didn't belong here. Still, he refused to let her get a rise out of him. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind," he said, turning back toward his house. Karen didn't move. "Just be careful, Marcus," she said, her voice suddenly softer, but laced with something unsettling. A warning, a threat, a promise. Marcus paused. He wanted to ignore her, to let it roll off his back like so many other microaggressions he had dealt with in his life. But something about the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. He turned back, but Karen was already walking away, disappearing into her house. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where she had just been. Something was wrong, and he had a feeling he was about to find out exactly what. The unease lingered long after Karen disappeared into her house. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He had dealt with entitled neighbors before, passive-aggressive notes, complaints about non-issues, stares that lasted a second too long, but this was different. Over the next few days, the disturbances continued, but now they were unmistakable. One morning, as Marcus stepped outside with his coffee, he found his pool gate wide open. He always locked it, always. Yet, there was swinging slightly in the breeze. Then, the next evening, he noticed wet footprints leading away from the pool. They weren't his. Something was happening, and it wasn't paranoia. Determined to get answers, Marcus checked his security cameras again. The files were corrupted, just like before. Someone had tampered with them. That was the last straw. He wasn't about to let this go. The next afternoon, Marcus sat on his patio, pretending to scroll through his phone. His gate was left slightly ajar on purpose. If someone was sneaking in, they'd take the bait. And sure enough, just as the sun began to dip, the intruder appeared. Karen. She walked boldly into his backyard, a towel slung over her shoulder, as if she had every right to be there. Without hesitation, she kicked off her sandals and lowered herself into his pool, sighing as if she had just stepped into a luxury spa. Marcus exhaled slowly. This wasn't just entitlement, this was audacity. He stood, arms crossed. "Enjoying yourself?" Karen screamed, jerking upright in the water. She scrambled toward the edge, nearly slipping in her panic. "What the hell, Marcus? You scared me," she shrieked, gripping the pool's edge. Marcus shook his head. "You're in my backyard, using my pool, without my permission." Karen rolled her eyes, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, please. It's just water. It's not like you even use it all the time." Marcus clenched his jaw. She was completely unbothered. No shame, no apology, just entitlement. "This isn't a public pool, Karen. You need to leave. Now." She scoffed, climbing out and grabbing her towel. "I don't see what the big deal is. You people are always so aggressive over the smallest things." Marcus froze. "You people." There was the thinly veiled racism, the kind disguised as an offhand comment but weighted with centuries of meaning. "Get off my property," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm. Karen smirked, her eyes flashing with something smug. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to lose his temper. Instead, he pulled out his phone. "I've got you on camera, trespassing. And I'm pretty sure breaking into someone's backyard isn't just rude. It's illegal." Karen's smirk faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you, Marcus," she said smoothly. "And why's that?" She smiled, sickly sweet. "Because if I call the police, who do you think they'll believe? The black guy threatening his white neighbor? Or me?" 20 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights lit up Marcus's driveway. He had stayed put, standing on his patio with his arms crossed while Karen had stormed in her house and dialed 911. The officers approached, one of them nodding toward Karen, who was standing in her doorway, her eyes red like she had been crying. "We got a call about a disturbance," the officer said, glancing between Marcus and Karen. "She claims you threatened her." Marcus exhaled sharply. "Of course. She's lying," Marcus said simply. "She broke into my backyard and used my pool. I have security footage." Karen let out a dramatic gasp, clutching her chest. "Oh my God, he's making things up. I was never in his yard." "I came outside to ask him to turn down his music, and he snapped, started threatening me, telling me I didn't belong here." One of the officers turned toward Marcus. Sir, step off your property. We need to sort this out. Marcus's stomach twisted. There it was. The assumption. He had seen this happen before, to people who looked like him. The moment a black man was accused, he became the problem. But this time, Marcus was ready. He unlocked his phone and pulled up the security footage. I'd love to comply, officer, but before I do, can I show you something? The officers hesitated as Marcus pressed play. On the screen, Karen was clear as day, walking through the gate, stepping into his pool, completely unbothered. Karen's smug expression crumbled. That's not me. He edited that, she shrieked. One of the officers sighed, rubbing his temple. Ma'am, this footage is time-stamped, and it shows you on his property. Karen's face turned red. Marcus crossed his arms, watching her crumble under the weight of her own lies. This wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. For the first time, Karen had lost control. The tension in the air was thick, the flashing red and blue lights casting eerie reflections against the darkening sky. Karen stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of fake distress and simmering rage. She was confident, too confident. She had played this game before and had always come out on top. You see, officers, she began, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. I have been feeling unsafe in my own neighborhood. He's been acting aggressively toward me, and tonight, when I simply asked him to keep the noise down, he lost it. Started yelling, making threats. I was terrified. Marcus didn't move. He'd seen people like her before. Entitled, manipulative, weaponizing their privilege like a loaded gun. He knew how this worked. She was painting him as the villain, knowing full well how the world would see them. A delicate, distressed white woman versus a strong, imposing black man. One of the officers turned to Marcus, his expression unreadable. Sir, do you have anything to say about these accusations? Marcus took a slow breath, steadying himself. He refused to let her shake him, refused to let the anger clawing at his chest take over. That's what she wanted. That's what they all wanted, to see him lose control. Instead, he pulled out his phone and calmly scrolled through his security footage. Before I answer that, I think you should take a look at something. He extended the phone toward the officer. You'll see exactly what happened tonight. Karen scoffed loudly. Are you serious? He probably faked that. Do you know how easy it is to edit a video these days? She laughed, looking around for validation, but the second officer had already stepped forward to view the footage. The screen flickered to life, showing Karen striding onto Marcus's property, slipping into his pool as if she owned it. The footage was crystal clear, time-stamped, undeniable. And then there was the audio. Karen's voice ringing out through the speakers, her words laced with entitlement. You don't even use it that much. You people are always so aggressive over nothing. If I call the cops, who do you think they'll believe? Silence. Karen paled, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to spin another lie. But for the first time, she had nothing. One officer glanced at his partner before turning back to Karen. Ma'am, is this you in the video? Karen shook her head wildly. It's taken out of context. He set me up. I was checking on his property. I thought he might be trespassing in someone else's yard. Marcus let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. So, you're telling me you thought I was trespassing in my own backyard? Karen's hands clenched into fists. She had been so sure she could twist this in her favor, so sure that she could control the narrative like she always had. But this time, she had miscalculated. The second officer cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. Ma'am, you made a false report. That's a crime. Karen's eyes widened in shock, as if the very concept of consequences was foreign to her. No. You don't understand. He's dangerous. People like him, they always... People like me? Marcus repeated, his voice eerily calm. Go ahead. Finish that sentence. Karen swallowed hard, her face twisting in fury. She knew she had lost, but she couldn't accept it. You can't arrest me for this. She started, but her voice cracked as the reality set in. The officers weren't siding with her this time. Turn around, ma'am, the officer instructed firmly. Karen snapped, lunging toward Marcus in a last-ditch effort, her nails reaching for his face. But before she could touch him, Strong arms caught her, restraining her in an instant. "You're under arrest for trespassing and filing a false police report," the officer stated, clicking the cuffs around her wrists. Karen let out a piercing scream, thrashing wildly. "No, you don't understand. I am the victim here." Her words were drowned out by the sound of neighbors gathering on their porches, watching. For years, Karen had bullied people into silence, her reputation as a nuisance tolerated, her privilege shielding her from accountability. But tonight, she wasn't untouchable anymore. As she was shoved into the back of the police car, Marcus let out a slow breath, his body finally relaxing. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to justice. The air was thick with tension as Karen struggled against the handcuffs, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. She had never been held accountable before, not like this. She had always been able to spin the narrative, to cry her way out of trouble, to make sure they believed her over people like Marcus. But tonight, that power was slipping away. "I will have your jobs for this," she screamed at the officers, her voice shrill with desperation. "Do you know who I am? I have connections. My brother is a lawyer. My cousin works for the mayor's office. You are making a big mistake." Marcus stood back, watching her unravel. He had seen this exact moment before, when people like her realized the world wasn't bending to their will for once. It was almost laughable how fragile their entitlement became when they were forced to play by the same rules as everyone else. The officer pinning Karen against the police car's side, unimpressed. "Ma'am, continuing to resist is only going to make things worse for you." Karen whipped her head toward Marcus, her teeth clenched. "You think this is funny? You think you've won? You're nothing but—" "Careful, Karen," Marcus interrupted smoothly, tilting his head. "You wouldn't want to say something racist on camera, would you?" She froze, her breath hitching. Marcus slowly lifted his phone, the camera still recording. The red light blinked softly in the corner of the screen, a silent promise that every single word coming out of her mouth was being captured. And the best part? She had already incriminated herself. He swiped through the footage, pulling up the clearest clip of Karen standing by the pool, barking insults at him just before she called the police. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You're nothing but a monkey, and you're beneath me. If you ever mow this lawn again, I'll make sure you regret it." The officer stiffened. Even the one who had seemed neutral at first narrowed his eyes as the audio crackled through the air. Karen's lips parted, her face going ghostly pale. That's not me. He edited that. He's trying to frame me." "Ma'am," one of the officers said, shaking his head, "it's a live recording. It's time-stamped. You said those words tonight." No, it was taken out of context. The officer wasn't listening anymore. He turned to Marcus. "Would you be willing to send that file to us for evidence?" "Gladly." Marcus tapped his screen and sent the file over. Karen's world was imploding before her eyes. The confidence, the smugness, the arrogance, all of it was gone. "Wait, please," she begged now, her voice cracking as the weight of reality settled on her shoulders. I didn't mean it. You don't understand. I was just upset. He was provoking me." Marcus folded his arms. "By mowing my lawn? By existing?" Karen swallowed hard, her head whipping around as she scanned the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch. They weren't on her side anymore. For the first time, people weren't looking at her as a victim. They were looking at her like a problem. "Karen," a voice called out, and she flinched. It was Mrs. Decker, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She had always been polite but distant with Marcus, neither friendly nor hostile. But tonight, her face was twisted in disapproval. "I heard everything," Mrs. Decker said, stepping forward. "I watched from my porch when you walked into his yard like you owned the place. And I heard what you called him." Karen's breath hitched. No, you must be mistaken. I would never." "Don't lie, Karen." Karen looked around, desperate. More neighbors were stepping closer, their expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. She had spent years cultivating an image. The perfect neighbor. The homeowners association's loudest voice. The self-proclaimed protector of neighborhood values. But now, that image was crumbling. "Maybe it's time we talked about some of the things you've done over the years," another neighbor, Mr. Patel, added, crossing his arms. Like how my son's bike went missing and you accused those kids from the next neighborhood over, without proof. Or how you called the police on the Garcias nephew because he looked suspicious when he was just watering their plants. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was all coming back now. Every false report, every lie, every moment of manipulation. The officer who had originally been neutral now turned back to Karen with renewed scrutiny. Ma'am, we're going to need to have a further discussion about these repeated incidents. Filing false police reports is a crime. And given your history, it seems like this is a pattern of behavior. No! Karen shrieked, thrashing again, but this time it was pure panic. No, please. This isn't fair. He tricked me. You don't understand. I'm not a racist. Marcus shook his head. They always said that when they got caught, the police didn't release her. They didn't apologize. They didn't let her walk away. Instead, they guided her into the back of the police car as she sobbed hysterically, her words barely coherent anymore. As the door shut behind her, the street fell silent. Marcus turned toward the crowd, feeling their eyes on him. Some looked ashamed. Some looked uncomfortable. But a few, like Mrs. Decker and Mr. Patel, looked at him with something close to respect. A slow exhale left his lips. He had done it. For once, the tables had truly turned. The flashing red and blue lights eventually faded as the police car, carrying Karen, disappeared down the street. A hushed silence settled over the neighborhood, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just moments before. Marcus stood in his driveway, arms crossed, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline. He had won. But why did it feel so surreal? For years, he had watched stories like this play out. Black men being falsely accused, their lives upended by a single phone call. Too many times, the system had worked against them. But tonight, justice had held its ground. The truth had been undeniable, and for once, Karen's lies had backfired on her instead of him. Mrs. Decker stepped closer, her expression conflicted. Marcus, she said hesitantly, clasping her hands in front of her. I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. We all should have. A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd of neighbors. Some shuffled awkwardly, avoiding eye contact, while others looked downright guilty. They had stood by and watched Karen torment people for years, never intervening. Tonight had been a wake-up call. Marcus let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of their words. It shouldn't have taken this, he said, his voice calm but firm. It shouldn't have taken video evidence, a public meltdown, and a police report for people to believe me. Silence. No one had an answer for that. Mr. Patel stepped forward, shaking his head. I think it's time we start paying attention to who we let speak for this neighborhood. Karen has been pushing people around for years, filing complaints, making accusations. I don't know why we ever let her have so much power. That's going to change, another neighbor muttered. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Karen had spent years wielding her privilege like a weapon, and now that weapon had turned against her. Word of what had happened spread fast. By morning, Karen Monroe was the talk of Maplewood Heights. Her arrest made waves in the community. Her face splashed across local news as the woman who had tried, and failed, to weaponize the police against her black neighbor. It didn't take long for people to dig deeper into her history, uncovering a trail of past complaints, false reports, and entitled behavior that painted a much clearer picture. Her position on the Homeowners Association? Revoked. Her carefully curated reputation? Destroyed. Her job at the local real estate agency? Gone. Karen had built her entire life around control, around making people fear her influence. Now, she had none. And Marcus? For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. No more stolen towels. No more strange disturbances. No more glares from across the fence. Karen's house, once a hive of passive-aggressive chaos, now stood eerily quiet. The next weekend, as Marcus stepped onto his patio, he let out a content sigh. The sun was warm, the water sparkled, and for the first time in weeks, he wasn't watching his back. He wasn't holding tension in his shoulders, waiting for the next problem. He sank into the cool water, letting it wash away the last remnants of the storm that had passed. This was his home. his peace. And no one, not Karen, not anyone, was ever going to take that from him again.